So, where is God in the book of Esther? That's the focus of our study for today. Now, although we're focusing on the book of Esther, I think that I might say some things that will spill over into other areas, implications for understanding other matters connected with reading the Bible. But we'll get to those things in our conversation afterwards. Where is God in the book of Esther? Esther has been a conundrum for biblical interpreters for centuries. And that's one of the reasons why I brought it to the Adventist Today Sabbath seminar, because I would like us to pool our collective wisdom and see whether we can move the conversation on a little bit from where it has been for the last few centuries. So there's no pressure on you. It's just that I'm looking for insight, innovation, and profound thought. Okay. Before we get to the main topic concerning some aspects of Esther, I want to take the time to briefly set out what the plot line of the book is. This is just to refresh our memories. So we'll just rattle through the basic steps that we find in the book of Esther. So King Ahasuerus deposes Queen Vashti. This is in the Persian Empire. King Ahasuerus deposes Queen Vashti and looks for a replacement. And he chooses Esther. Of all the people he could choose, he chooses Esther, a Jew. And the king at about the same time promotes Haman to be his top official in the empire. Esther's uncle Mordecai, however, offends Haman, and as a consequence, Haman plots to destroy all the Jews in the empire, not just to get revenge against Mordecai, but against all Jews. So Mordecai asks Esther to appeal to the king to help the Jewish people. Esther, in response, invites the king and Haman to a banquet. And while that banquet's being prepared, during that period, Haman builds a gallows on which to hang Mordecai. When the banquet starts, at that banquet, Esther reveals Haman's plot to the king. The king is not pleased, and the king hangs Haman on the gallows that he built for Mordecai. But Haman's decree to exterminate the Jews is still in force. It cannot be repealed. It's the law of the Medes and Persians. And so Esther arranges for a decree of her own, which allows the Jews to defend themselves should they be attacked. The Jews defeat those who attack them. Mordecai is promoted to second position in the empire, and Esther reigns as queen. That, I've obviously left out some details, but those are the basic steps as we go through this book. Now, the reason for dealing with Esther is specifically this, that it is unique in the Bible in that it never mentions God. The Song of Solomon comes close to not mentioning God, but there is probably one verse in the Song of Solomon which does mention God. But in addition to simply God not being mentioned, there's something else often not mentioned, and that is that the characters in the book of Esther never engage in any religious activity. There's never any explicit mention of that either. However, it's even more complex than what I've just outlined, being no God and no religious activity, because we have three versions of the book of Esther that have come down to us. And it's helpful for us to be aware of these three. So these are the three versions of Esther. There's the Hebrew version. This is the one I've just been talking about. It never mentions God. And no characters, Jewish or Persian, express any religious thought or perform any religious action. And this is the version which is authoritative for Jews and Protestants. So as we move on, I will probably refer to this version of Esther as being the canonical version, because it's in the canon that we read. Okay, so I'll probably refer to it as the canonical version. But there is also a Greek version. You see in the headline there, the Roman numerals for 70. This is the standard abbreviation for the Septuagint. This is the standard Greek translation. And the Septuagint, this Greek version, does mention God because it has, in addition to the text that we are familiar with, it also has 6 additions, 6 blocks of material scattered throughout the book. And in the additions, the Jews in general, and Esther and Mordecai in particular, are faithful and observant. And there's plenty mentions about God as well. And this is the version which is authoritative for Roman Catholics, Eastern Orthodox, and some other Christian groups. But it is apocryphal for others. So as we move on, I'll probably refer to this as the apocryphal version, by which I'm referring to the Greek Septuagint version. Plenty of references to God. So it's very different from the Hebrew version that we're used to. And then there is a second Greek version, usually called the Alpha text. And this Greek version also mentions God. It has the same 6 additions as the Greek Septuagint has, but in the Alpha text, there are some references to God and to religious activity in the main text, woven into small details in the text. So the additions it shares with the Septuagint. So, like the Septuagint, the additions, the Jews in general, Esther and Mordecai in particular, are faithful and observant. But this Alpha text exists only in 4 medieval manuscripts. And this is not authoritative for anybody. It is not canonical for anybody. So it's a bit of a maverick version. But 3 versions, 1 Hebrew, 2 Greek. The Hebrew version never mentions God or religion. The 2 Greek versions do, and do so repeatedly. Let me give you an idea of the kind of addition that you get in the apocryphal version. In addition C, in chapter 3 of Esther, Esther prays, and she says, as she begins, "My Lord, our King, the only one, come to my help, for I am alone and have no helper but you, and am about to take my life in my hands. I have been taught from infancy in the bosom of my family that you, Lord, have chosen Israel out of all the nations and our ancestors out of all before them to be your heritage forever." And so it continues. So here, unlike anything we have in the Hebrew version, in the canonical version, Esther prays. She addresses God. She is aware that the Jews are the chosen people of God. So this is a standard, pious, theologically conventional statement in the apocryphal version, but we have nothing like this in the canonical version. So our problem is this, that the canonical version, the one that we are familiar with, is the godless version of Esther. And so that raises the question in many people's minds, why is this book in the Bible? Now, historically, there have been 2 broad answers to that question as to why Esther is in the Bible. And it comes down to perceiving either the presence of God or the absence of God. The first major approach, major thesis A, okay, is this, that God is present, but hidden. God is in the book of Esther, in the canonical version of Esther, but you've got to go searching for him. He's there, but he's hidden. So let's look at some representative arguments which find God in the canonical version of Esther. And as I go through these, I'd like you to be asking yourself, do you find these arguments convincing or not? The first argument I want to look at is the one that says you can find God in the coincidences in the book. So what is meant by the coincidences? Well, when you come to the book, you discover that it just so happens that, well, a vacancy for a queen arises. Now, let me ask you, how often does that occur? You know, I don't doubt if any of the women in the seminar today have ever applied for the position of queen that they've seen vacant somewhere. So it's unusual to begin with. And then from numerous candidates, out of all the candidates that could be chosen, it just so happens that the king chooses a Jew, that is Esther. And it just so happens that Esther has an uncle, Mordecai, and he overhears a plot against the king. But he is not rewarded for this, which is unusual because you would expect somebody to be rewarded for saving the king's life. However, it just so happens that one night the king cannot sleep. And so because he cannot sleep, his officials read to him from the official records. I mean, what better way of getting to sleep than getting somebody to read to you the church board minutes, okay? And would you believe it? Would you believe it? It just so happens that they start reading from the very page, out of all the pages that he could have read from the very page recording Mordecai's act of saving the king, leading the king to ask if he was ever rewarded, and being told no, he wasn't. And would you believe this? It just so happens that the king asks that question at the very moment when Haman arrives at the palace to request the execution of Mordecai, whom the king is now going to reward. And of course, ultimately, this leads to the deliverance of the Jews. And the basic argument here is where people say, look, there are just too many coincidences. This must point beyond itself. Let me give you a flavor of the kind of argument that's used here by Brian Gregory. He says, so many coincidences cannot be accidental. Like a subtle signpost, they point to an invisible hand at work, orchestrating every event to accomplish a purpose. As the old adage goes, coincidences are just God's way of remaining anonymous. There's no mistaking it. God is at work in all these events. He is subtle. He is not expressly mentioned, but he is there and he is at work. So the coincidences are proof of God's presence. That is the basic argument. Perhaps as well, though, we should consider how the Old Testament presents coincidences. I'll give you one example. Let me give you the background to this next passage, which comes from 1 Samuel. Just before this, in 1 Samuel, the Philistines have captured the Ark of the Covenant. They take it back to Philistia, but all kinds of dire consequences follow. And so they decide that the Ark of the Covenant is too hot to handle, and they decide to send it back to Israel. And they discuss, how are we going to send it back? to Israel. That's the background. So let's begin reading this. Now then, they say, take and prepare a new cart and 2 milk cows on which there's never come a yoke, and yoke the cows to the cart, but take their calves home, away from them, and take the ark of the Lord and place it on the cart. Then send it off and let it go its way and watch. So the idea is this then. They're going to get cows who have calves. They're going to hitch the cows to the cart, and they're going to take the calves back home, separate them from their mothers. And then, putting the ark on this cart, they're going to say, all right, let the cows go free and watch and see what happens. Now, normally, of course, you would expect those cows to head back to their calves. That's the thinking behind what they're doing. So they say this, watch. If it goes up on the way to its own land, that is, if these cows go all the way along the road to Israel, to Beth Shemesh, then it is God who has done us this great harm. But if not, then we shall know that it is not his hand that struck us. It happened to us by coincidence. So if the cows go straight to Israel, we know it's God at work. But if the cows just come home, we know it's simply a coincidence. In other words, there's a distinction between coincidence and God's activity. Just because there is a coincidence does not mean that God is at work. Sometimes coincidences are simply coincidences and not evidence of God. Well, that's one argument for you to bear in mind. Do you find coincidences a plausible explanation for the absence of God in the book? A question we've all got to ask, of course, is what is the point of hiding God if coincidences do point the way? All right, so God is present but hidden. Coincidence is used to argue it. A second argument is that you have echoes of the Exodus in the book of Esther. The Exodus is the single most significant event in the Old Testament. The Exodus is as significant for Old Testament theology as the resurrection is for New Testament theology. So the fact that Esther has connections with the Exodus might well suggest God's presence. So let's have a look at this. Broad similarities between Esther and the Exodus. In both Esther and the Exodus, the Israelites, or the Jews, are outside the land of promise. So they're in exile. I'll expand on that in a minute. Also, in Esther and Exodus, they are threatened by a royal decree. In Exodus, it's the Pharaoh of Egypt, and in Esther, it is Haman's decree to exterminate the Jews. In both places, the Jews' deliverer is in the royal court. Moses in Exodus and Esther in the book of Esther. So there are broad similarities. But what if we focus a little bit more on specifically Esther and Moses as characters? Well, they are both adopted. Moses was adopted by Pharaoh's daughter. We all know that story in Exodus. And also in Esther, we're told that Mordecai adopted Esther after her parents died. Also, Esther and Moses hide their identity. When Moses flees from the Egyptian court into the wilderness of Midian after killing that Egyptian, the daughters of Jethro go home to their father and say, we've met this fellow. We met this Egyptian out in the wilderness. But of course, we all know he's not an Egyptian. He's a Hebrew. And in the book of Esther, Esther also hides her identity. Mordecai tells her explicitly, in the court, do not tell anyone that you are a Jew. He tells her that, and she complies with that. So the true identity of Esther and Moses is unknown in both stories. Both Esther and Moses have an associate, important for what they do. Moses has Aaron, who does all the talking, most of the talking. And Esther has Mordecai, who at the beginning of the story directs Esther what to do. Later on, she becomes independent, but nevertheless, Esther and Moses both have these significant associates. And both Esther and Moses appear before the monarch to save their people. Moses, on more than one occasion, goes down to the river, meets Pharaoh, and tells him, let my people go. And Esther, we've all got these images of Esther approaching the king. Will he hold out that scepter for her or not? She's going to plead for the welfare and the salvation of her people. So there are some close resemblances between the two main characters, Esther and Moses. Now, what is the significance of all this then for the absence of God in the book of Esther? Well, the argument is this. Given that we see so many parallels between the book of Esther and the account of the Exodus, what we need to do, some people say, is transfer all of the theological significance of the Exodus into the text of Esther. And when we do that, God is clearly present, though hidden. However, there are some significant differences, dissimilarities between Esther and the Exodus. I'll just give you a few. The one we already know, because this is where we started. In the Exodus, God's miraculous actions and speech are explicit. But in Esther, as we've already seen, in the canonical Esther, God is not present, never acts, never speaks. It's a very different set of circumstances. In Exodus, Exodus establishes the Passover as the memorial of their deliverance from slavery. When you come to Esther, and when you look at the chronology and the dates given to us in the book of Esther, the Passover coincides with the crisis of Haman's decree. Haman promulgates his decree on the eve of Passover, but the Jews do not celebrate it. There's no mention of the Passover being celebrated. You would have thought observant Jews would have been huddled around the Passover table, celebrating like they've never celebrated before, given the threat to them. But in Esther, complete silence. And perhaps the most significant issue here is that in Exodus, the focus is on returning to the land of promise. That's what the Exodus is all about. That's what the word Exodus means. A way out, the road out of Egypt to the promised land. But in Esther, the focus is on deliverance and continuing to live in peace. In Persia, not a soul suggests returning to Judah. So there is a significant difference between Exodus. In Exodus, Israel is living in exile. When you're in exile, you know that where you're living is not home. Whereas in Esther, the Jews of Esther no longer see themselves as living in exile. They are living in the diaspora. They are Jews, they're of Jewish heritage, but Persia is now their home. There's no desire to go back to the country where their great-grandparents came from. No, they're now Persian Jews. So the context and outcomes are very different. So the question here would be, perhaps, what do you find more convincing? Is it the similarities or the dissimilarities? Are we any closer to perceiving God in Esther when we see these parallels to the Exodus, or are we as far away as when we started? Then there's one more. One more suggestion. I mean, there's a bewildering number of suggestions. I'm just giving you representative ones. But under this general approach that God is present but hidden, the final one I want to look at is the conversation between Mordecai and Esther in Esther chapter 4, verses 14 to 16. Now, if there is any argument that has stood the test of time, it's this one. This is Exhibit A for the presence of God in the book of Esther. They don't come any stronger than this. We're just going to look at the most important detail. Chapter 4, verse 14. Mordecai speaks to Esther and says, "If you keep silence at such a time as this, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another quarter, but you and your father's family will perish." Aha! Say, the hunters for God's presence in the book. It's as plain as the nose on your face. This must refer to God from another quarter. What other quarter could Mordecai possibly be referring to? He's talking about the salvation of the Jews. And where can salvation for the Jews come from except from God? He's going to save his chosen people. Well, that usually gets a round of amens, from enthusiastic supporters in the congregation. But how do we read Mordecai's words? Because what I've given you here is the standard conventional translation. And it is Mordecai making a confident assertion. Relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another quarter. But if that is what he's saying, then what he's saying is incoherent. Because what he would be saying, let's just unpack the logic of what he's saying. He's saying, Esther, if you do nothing, then B, the Jews will be delivered in another way. But C, you and your family will perish. Now, there are two big problems here. If you do nothing, the Jews will be delivered in another way. In other words, the Jews are going to be delivered regardless of whether Esther does anything or not. Well, if the Jews are going to be delivered, whether Esther does something or not, there is no crisis. If the deliverance of the Jews is inevitable, whether she acts or not, there is no crisis, and that all the Jews can go to bed that night and sleep well. The second point is that if the Jews will inevitably be delivered, why in the world will you and your family perish? If all the Jews are going to be delivered, why would Esther and her family perish? So this simply doesn't hang together. So what's the solution to this incoherence? Well, I think the solution is this, that Mordecai is not making an assertion, but he's asking a rhetorical question. Now, this is an argument put forward a bit over 30 years ago now by a biblical scholar called Wiebe, and increasing numbers of people are following what he says. Now, I'm sorry about this, but you'll just have to trust me on this, all right? What I'm going to say next is perfectly possible and feasible according to the rules of Hebrew grammar and syntax. There are no smoke and mirrors are involved in what I'm going to say next. Trust me, you know, I'm a pastor. Now, instead of making an assertion, Mordecai is asking a rhetorical question. And this is how it unfolds. The rhetorical question is this: Esther, if you do nothing, will relief and deliverance arise from another quarter? You see, not relief and deliverance will arise, but will relief and deliverance arise from another quarter? He's asking this rhetorical question. And because it's rhetorical, of course, you're not expecting a spoken answer. But the unspoken answer is no. Relief and deliverance won't arise from another quarter. And the consequence is that Mordecai says, therefore, you and your family will perish. Don't think that just because you're in the palace, you're going to survive. Haman's after all of us. And then the appeal then comes at the end. Perhaps you have come to royal dignity for just such a time as this. How many commencement addresses have taken that as their text? For just such a time as this. Now, in other words, when seen as a rhetorical question, Mordecai's words are coherent and underline the fact that Esther is the Jews' only hope. It is not a statement about divine intervention regardless. But it requires that we interpret and translate his words as a question. Do you think that's fair enough or not? Okay, so that was looking at the first side of the ways in which people deal with the absence of God by saying God is present but hidden. Now, in less detail, I'm going to look at the second major thesis, which tackles the question of why God is absent from the canonical Esther. And it's this. Yeah, look, God is absent. That is the point of the book. In other words, don't waste time straining at arguments to find God when he's not there. God is absent. And if you read carefully, you'll see that that is the point of the book. Explain away his absence, and you've missed the point of the book. So I'm going to look at two representative arguments here. The first is this, that during the course of the Old Testament storyline, God moves increasingly into the background. And if we take that into account, it explains why God isn't in Esther. So let me explain this. The evidence for saying that during the course of the Old Testament storyline, God moves increasingly into the background, the evidence for this is the following. This is very, very condensed, you understand, okay? And but I'm trying to give you the basic argument. In Genesis 1 to 11, where the Old Testament begins, if we're following the Old Testament storyline, okay? The storyline begins at creation, obviously. In Genesis 1 to 11, God is everywhere. He acts and he speaks constantly. Creation, he speaks it into existence. The flood, the Tower of Babel, he's everywhere. He's present everywhere, loud and in miraculous circumstances. That's Genesis 1 to 11. When we come through to Sinai, the giving of the law, this is the last time that God addresses Israel as a whole. The whole company of Israel hear God. Last time he does it. At Solomon's temple, the dedication of Solomon's temple, it's the last time the Shekinah glory is seen. Now, it's mentioned in one or two visionary experiences, but as far as people experiencing it in real life, never again after the inauguration of Solomon's temple. Then we come on a couple of centuries, a century or so, to Elijah, 9th century. Elijah on top of Mount Carmel, when the fire from heaven comes down and consumes that offering before all Israel. That is the last of God's public miracles before all Israel. Never does it again. We come on to Hezekiah a century or two later, and we see here the last of God's private miracles. This is the occasion when Hezekiah's life is extended, you remember. It's a bit difficult to translate, but conventionally it's been translated as the shadow on the sundial. Retreat, some kind of miraculous event, however we should understand it. But that's the last time God does a private miracle. And then by the time we come to Ezra and Nehemiah, this is after the exile, people have returned. In the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, God does not act or speak. People interpret his presence, yes, but there's nothing like God as God was acting in Genesis 1 to 11 or at Sinai. God does not turn up as an acting or speaking character in those books. But of course, people of faith interpret his presence. So it might be just as well if I give you a couple of statements by scholars who summarize what's going on here with the disappearance of God. So Richard Friedman says this: gradually, through the course of the Hebrew Bible, the deity appears less and less to humans, speaks less and less. Miracles, angels, all other signs of divine presence become rarer and finally cease. In the last portions of the Hebrew Bible, God is not present in the well-known apparent ways of the earlier books. And then Aaron Koller has this to say: while the graph of divine involvement in the Hebrew Bible is not a straight line with a negative slope ending at 0, this, by the way, is an important point to make. There is this movement, but there are peaks and troughs. It's not just a dead straight line, okay? So though it's not a straight line with a negative slope ending at 0, it does clearly have a trend line, and that clearly does have a negative slope. there is a powerful and clear statement being made over the course of the Hebrew Bible about the changing, that is, decreasing role of God in the world. Right then, what does this have to do with Esther? Well, Esther is found at the end of the Old Testament storyline. We've come a long way from Genesis 1 to 11. And what the book of Esther at the end of the Old Testament storyline does is simply to take the increasing disappearance of God from center stage. It simply takes it one step further and eliminates God altogether from the text. That is the argument that is made. Okay. So for the sake of argument, if just for the sake of argument, we accept that just for the moment, what are the implications of this observation? Well, there may be some profound implication which go far beyond the book of Esther. And it would be this. When we get to the end of the Old Testament storyline, the Old Testament's been going for quite a while, and we get to the end of its storyline in the time of Esther, Ezra, and Nehemiah. Have we actually arrived at the climax of the Old Testament? And if we see the end of that storyline as the climax of the Old Testament, should we give the end of the Old Testament priority over the beginning of the Old Testament as far as its depiction of God is concerned? Because usually, and we should know this as Adventists, usually it's the beginning that's emphasized. Creation, flood, call of Abraham. It's the beginning which is given precedence rather than the end. But on some things, at least, should we give precedence to the end of the story where Esther resides rather than the beginning? What are the implications? I'm going to set this out by paraphrasing some rather dense scholarship. Okay, so I hope I've unpacked this so that it's understandable. I'm unpacking something written by Mark McIntyre. So, is each detail of God's characterization in the Old Testament of equal significance, regardless of where it appears in the chronology of the Old Testament storyline? So, throughout the Old Testament storyline, we're told this, that, and the other about God. Is each of those of equal significance? Or should we follow the characterization of God as it develops from its earliest to its latest form? You know, from Genesis, where God is present, speaks, acts, and is everywhere available. Should we stress that? Or the latest form, where God is much more subtly, and some might say profoundly, found, where people of faith interpret God's presence in the world. They don't hear his voice. There's not a bolt from the blue. So then, do the more mature understandings of God's ways in the world occur at the end of the Old Testament rather than at its beginning? If so, we should give priority to the end of that story rather than its beginning. Yet typically the beginning dominates theological discussion. So if we give more emphasis to the end of the story, bring the end of the story into the center of our theological reflection, well, of course, Esther belongs to the end of that storyline. So its lack of a conventional theology, lack of a conventional presentation of God, might be conveying something important to us. The trick, of course, is what exactly is it conveying to us? We can discuss that in a few minutes. All right then, so we're looking at those who would argue that God is absent from Esther, and that's the point of the book. What we've just looked at is, as the Old Testament storyline proceeds, God recedes into the background and human beings come to the fore. Does Esther simply continue that trend? In other words, once you see the trend, then what happens in Esther is no longer that surprising. The second major argument, the last one I'm going to deal with, as we bring this home, is this: are the Jewish characters in Esther negative rather than positive? If so, is God's absence evidence of his judgment? Now, with this next argument, the last one I'm going to look at, conventionally, as we all know, Esther and Mordecai are presented as positive characters, righteous, pious, even prayerful people doing God's will. Now, if we say, actually, what is the evidence for that? And in fact, rather than being positive, they might be negative. This means that we need to reassess Esther, Mordecai, and the Jews. So are the Jewish characters negative? Could you make a case for that? Well, if you were going to make a case for them being negative, you might want to point out, for example, that they choose to remain in Persia decades after they could have returned to Jerusalem and restored the temple. Not a soul in the book of Esther is looking to return to Jerusalem. What kind of Jewish zeal for the Lord might that suggest? The narrative of Esther, I've already pointed this out, the narrative of Esther coincides with Passover, but there's no evidence that they celebrate it, when you would have thought this is a golden opportunity for them to do so with vigor. Not a mention. So how observant are these Jews? The account refers to Esther by her Persian name throughout, not her Jewish one, Hadassah. Why is Esther referred to by her Persian name throughout? Well, maybe she is simply an assimilated Jew. She no longer identifies culturally with her Jewish heritage. She's a Persian, but of Jewish extraction. So the book doesn't even use her Jewish name. Mordecai, remember, Mordecai tells her to hide her identity. Don't tell anybody you're a Jew. Don't reveal to anybody you're a Jew. Now, and she does it. So Esther cannot be observant. I mean, it would be impossible for an Orthodox, observant Jew living in the court not to reveal that she was Jewish. In all of her social interactions, she would have to indicate that she was Jewish, from clean and unclean foods to Sabbath observance to all kinds of things. But the fact that not a soul at the court knows that she's Jewish throughout all this time is an indication that she wasn't observant. Also, some see Esther's retribution at the end of the book as excessive and vindictive. You know, she goes out for a second go at the Persians. So the question could be raised, have the persecuted become the persecutors. Those who are persecuted at the beginning of the book have become the persecutors at the end of the book. And finally, just to remind us of the basic point, there is not a single example of Jewish piety, of religious devotion anywhere in the book. So, for the sake of argument, okay, just to take this one step further, if we take these points as being at least somewhat persuasive, if we do that, then God's absence might be understandable. Because if we go back to Deuteronomy 31, verse 18, here God is talking about the covenant which he has made with the people of Israel. And he's talking about what happens if Israel does not keep their side of the covenant. And he says, on that day, I will surely hide my face on account of all the evil they have done by turning to other gods. I will surely hide my face, which is Hebrew idiom for I will withdraw my presence from my people. And of course, if there is no presence of God in the book of Esther, then that's precisely what God has done. He has hidden his face. He said, I will surely hide my face. Now, just to make this a little more precise, I've included the Hebrew here in brackets. You notice the word in red font. I will surely hide. Now in Hebrew, that is haster astir. Haster astir. Does that ring any bells? Well, we are looking at the book of Esther, are we not? And I will surely hide my face. Haster astir sounds somewhat like Esther. Why? Why does it sound a little bit like Esther? Well, the name by which the main character is known in this book is Esther. That is a Persian name. But of course, this is a Hebrew text, the canonical version of Esther. So it's written in Hebrew. And there you have the Hebrew name of Esther as it appears in the book. Now, if you were to ask an ancient Hebrew speaker, you see that Hebrew word, if it's treated as a Hebrew word, what does Esther mean in Hebrew? And in Hebrew, Esther means, I will hide. So the name of the main character means I will hide. And God said, I will hide my face from those who turn their back on the covenant. So is this subtle literary way of referring to God hiding his face, withdrawing his presence from his people in the very name of the main character in the book? Well, we'll see what you make of that when we discuss, maybe. So let me sum up what we've done. What I've been doing is giving you an idea of the ways in which people have tried to deal with the anomaly of God's absence from the book, and also, to some extent, the absence of any human devotion, religious devotion. There are two main arguments. One is God is present, but hidden, right? And we looked at coincidences, and the echoes of the Exodus, and the deliverance will come from another place. There are arguments for, arguments against each of those. The other major approach is to say, no. God is absent. Because in the Old Testament, God moves increasingly into the background, and Esther just takes that one step further. It conforms to a pattern, in other words. Well, what it might mean is another thing, but that's what happens. Or God's absence is evidence of his judgment on the Jews. Now, these are just 5 of, as I say, I think I have found 38 different arguments, one way or the other. So this is just a selection. Let me conclude with this statement, which might launch us into discussion. The issue in Esther is not simply that God is never mentioned, and thus not explicitly involved with the Jews. The problem is also that they never mention worship or attempt to interact with him. This is the book's unique contribution to the canon. What motivation could this narrator have possessed to compose a narrative that indirectly recalled biblical tradition, for example, the Exodus, yet at the same time to eliminate any overt mention of Israel's faith? What is the answer to the conundrum of the canonical Esther? I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Wow. I'm sure that Dr. Laurence has stirred up so much intrigue in all our minds. I do remember when I saw Rahul's hand go up in the earlier part of the discussion, I was like, wow, just from, the beginning, he's put all of these questions in our heads. And then now is the time when we get to have our open discussion on what we've learned or what we've taken away from Dr. Lawrence's presentation. So Rahul, your hand has been up for a very long time. So I'm going to ask you to unmute your mic and let's start the conversation with you today.
Yes, hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, excellent. I have 2 concerns. First of all, I know the patriarchs had concubines. Abraham had Hagar, and then Jacob had Leah and, not Leah, Sephora and Bilhah, I believe they were the names. So I'm assuming that Esther was a concubine along with all the other 100 or 1,000 young women that were in the beauty contest. If that is the case, then she spent the entire night with the king, and he liked her sexual prowess because he gave her the winning prize. Now, the Bible in both Testaments condemns sex outside of marriage, and here we have the heroine of a major book of the Bible that had premarital sex, or at least was a concubine, along with 100 or 1,000 other women. So it's very peculiar to glorify this young woman because she actually slept her way to the top, if you want to put it that way. And I'm not making this up. My Adventist theology teacher in Atlantic Union College in the 70s, he mentioned that was how Esther got to have that first role. She spent the night with the king in bed, and therefore he liked what she did, or what he saw of her naked. So that's a concern of mine, because both testaments condemn sex outside of marriage. The other thing that concerns me is at the very end, as the speaker mentioned, the Jews turn on their attackers. Now, up until that point, I only thought Haman was the one that hated the Jews, but it seems that more people hated the Jews. If the Jews in Esther's time attacked and really killed all of the people that were attacking them, that also assumes they killed their children and their babies. So I have a very distaste when I read this book. And at the very end, all those people, whether they were good or really bent on killing the Jews, they all perished, including their little children. So whenever I read this book, it is with great dissatisfaction and distaste. However, the one time I read the Greek version of Esther with all the mention of God, I found it a wonderfully delightful book. And those are my comments for today.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Well, what you've done really in bringing up these 2 points is really to add to the pile of arguments to say that these Jews are not virtuous, righteous Jews. They're not covenant observers. It's just more evidence of that. You know, we often gloss over. It says, you know, I think you did. We often do refer to Esther is chosen as a result of a beauty contest. It was a contest, but it wasn't just about beauty. You know, she went in to see the king in the evening, and in the morning she came out, and Esther pleased the king more than any of the others. One might be tempted to ask whether she'd had any practice before she'd been to see the king. You know, she performed so well. The only thing, and then at the end, as I said, the revenge attack on the Persians, is this self-defense, or is it not? Now you mentioned that there's a suggestion. Well, one way you translate the text is that they also kill women and children. There's a bit of a problem in the Hebrew translation there, whether it means that or not. But regardless of that point, is her request, you know, for extra time to get back at the persecutors, is that ethically justified or not? That would still stand. So it would add to the idea that, no, we need to reassess the characters of the Jews in this book. They're not exemplars of what we should be. They're actually examples of what we shouldn't be. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much for your contribution, Raul. And it is a good way to look at it, Dr. Laurence. I agree. That might also contribute to the argument that could have been why God was hiding himself in the book of Esther, yeah. Possibly. All right, Lauren, it is your turn to join our conversation.
Actually, I think Horace had his hand up.
Oh, Horace's hand was up, right? Oh, you're a host, right? So Horace, unmute your mic.
Yes.
And go ahead.
By the
and
way,
contribute.
this is my first time to meet Horace. He is become a really prolific writer for Adventist today, some really good pieces. So Horace, thank you.
You're very welcome, Lauren. And thank you, Laurence, for that very stimulating presentation. Now, one apologist for the presence of God in Esther suggests that the tetragrammaton, the YHWH that spells Yahweh, is present in about 3 or 4 places in the book of Esther at the beginning of 4 successive sentences, so that Yahweh is mentioned in Esther in acrostic form 3 or 4 times in the book of Esther. Is that a valid assertion?
Well, I'm glad you've asked this question, because this is a popular approach. And just to unpack a little bit of what you said, so that the rest of the folk are on board with this. The argument that Horace is talking about is one which says that God is present in the text by the Hebrew name for God, known as the tetragrammaton. If we translate that into Roman characters, YHWH, and that sequence of consonants is found in 4 places in Esther, not in successive sentences, but in different places in the book. So God reveals himself in the book by those, the sequence of 4 characters occurring, either characters at the beginning, four successive words with the characters occur at the beginning of the word, or whether they occur at the ends of the words, or whether you're reading in the right direction, or whether you're reading in the wrong direction. Okay, you end up with 4. Now, this gives me the opportunity to engage in sort of flagrant self-promotion, really, because I have written an article on this. And the reason I wrote the article is that it's a very common point of view. It is true what you say, you can find it, but the usual assumption is that it occurs in Esther and nowhere else in the Old Testament. That's what many people do, occurs nowhere else. So I looked at that and I thought, you know what, I'm going to find out whether that's true or not. And I discovered that in addition to Esther, it is found in 116 other places in the Hebrew Bible. So we cannot claim uniqueness for it in Esther. So I don't think there's any credence to it, simply because the consonants YHWH at the beginnings or ends of words is common in Hebrew. Those particular words, loads of verbs begin with a Y, loads of nouns begin with an H. That's the definite article. So somewhere along the line, you're going to get that sequence, but they don't occur in any obvious place which has theological significance. They're just random, and they occur randomly throughout the Hebrew Bible. So I don't think there's any significance to it. It gives me the opportunity to say that if any of you want to read the article, I can send you a copy of it. It's online on academia.edu if you want to read it in any detail. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Laurence, and thank you, Horace. Dr. Laurence, it would be great if you could drop that link in the chat for us of that article.
Okay, well, I'll tell you what I'll do. I will, it might be easier for me if let me just give you my email, and those of you interested, if you just let me know, I'll send you a copy of the article. If you just, is that okay?
Yes, that is okay. That is okay. Thank you. Okay, so Lauren, I think it is your turn to join the conversation. So. Go ahead and unmute yourself. Okay.
Absolutely stuff. I'm going to go at this from a little different direction and give you the background of how I came to, in the world that I lived in and grew up in, and certainly in much of evangelical Christianity. The canon of the Bible was just basically dropped from heaven. People would say, that's the Bible. It's in the Bible. And if it was in the Bible, it was true. If it was outside the Bible, even by a little bit, it was untrue. There's a big wall built around that canon. The implication always was that at some point God came down and said, now these are the books that are going to be put into the Bible. And this one here, that the Maccabees, that's not going to be in the Bible. And Judith is not going to be in the Bible. But the rest of these are all going to be in the Bible. And people would question that in the world that I grew up in and in much of evangelical Christianity. And it wasn't until fairly recent years that I began to realize that the process of things coming in or out of that special group of books was much more, what's the word, mushier, less crisp and defined than I thought it was. And I began to realize that, oh yeah, Moses probably didn't write that, and Paul probably didn't write this. And it changed my whole conception of this. And so my question is, how did Esther end up there? Did it go in and out? Did people question it? Did anybody say, whoa, that doesn't really fit with my picture of what the Bible should be about or what the Bible should say? And how did it, this came to mind, by the way. We were over in, some of you, I don't think probably Dr. Turner knows, but a lot of you may have heard of Branson, Missouri. We were over in Branson, Missouri, and Branson, Missouri is sort of Las Vegas for Christian conservatives. And it is, they have, the thing that a lot of people go to is a big stage show of Esther with fountains and fires and everything. And the Esther play is very popular. I mean, it's really well done. It's excessively lavish. And it is all set, it is all placed in the context of the rest of the Bible. Enough so that God is, throughout all the singing and everything, God is always there, and Esther is seeking God's will. And in the end, they have an altar call and ask everybody to accept Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior. Now, it's a ripping good yard, but how they got from there, from the story that's in the book to what they're doing with it, seems a little bit stretched to me. So back to my question, how did this become a popular book in the Jewish and religious setting when it doesn't seem to, on the face of it at least, qualify very well?
Right, yes. Well, of course, on the face of it, no, it doesn't. But the more I've studied Hebrew narrative, the more I've been amazed at how subtle and deep it can be. So you got a simple surface texture, but quite profound beneath. However, the answer to your question is we don't exactly know, because the process by which we arrive at the Old Testament canon is, the process is not known so much. Books became considered significant as time went on. But by the time, you remember on the road to Emmaus, I'm going from memory here, but on the road to Emmaus, Jesus spoke to the disciples and showed them, and it says, from Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms. And that seems to bear some relationship to the three portions of the Old Testament: the law, the prophets, and the writings. So the canon that's familiar to us was not quite fixed by the time of Jesus. It was only fixed somewhat later, but you'd be hard pressed. I mean, the Pharisees and the Sadducees argued with one another, but none of them would deny the significance of the books of Moses. I mean, that was, by the time of Jesus, that was a given, and the prophets. But some of the writings might have been a bit up for grabs, But why was Esther accepted? Well, some would say, it's on the basis of Esther that you get the Feast of Purim. And the Feast of Purim became really popular. And so because the feast is really popular, the text which presents us with the feast isn't necessarily somewhat authoritative, because the feast has become common.
Well, that's fascinating. So the ritual actually raised the status of the text that it was taken from.
Possibly, yeah, quite possibly.
Interesting.
But ultimately, we don't know, because we're trying to read people's minds. But that's certainly a possibility.
Did any of the Christian fathers or reformers wonder whether this really belonged?
Yes. So there's in the acceptance of Esther in Christian circles, there was a division between the East and the West, the Eastern Church and the Western Church. Now let me try and think. I'm going to get this right. I think I think the Western Church, well, whichever way it was, the Western Church, I think, which was dealing, I think, with what is our canonical text, had questions, but the East, which had the Septuagint, the Greek version, because it had plenty of God and prayer and everything else, it was more acceptable there. One of the reasons, however, the Book of Esther was never that popular in Christian circles. The first Christian commentary on the Book of Esther was not written until the 9th century. So we went through centuries, at least of those that have survived. So the oldest by Rabanus in the 9th century, but there's no commentary on the book before that. There's a well, there's another reason. One of the reasons might have been, sorry to giving you a longer answer than I was going to say, a longer answer than your question deserved. I didn't mean that.
Yeah,
but
no,
I mean, you asked a simple question and I'm making it more complicated, is what I mean. Is that in mixed Christian and Jewish communities, a problem arose because in the Greek version, Haman was crucified. Now, you have in mixed Christian and Jewish circles, you have the Christians who accept the Savior of the world crucified, and the Jews might sometimes intentionally provoke the Christians by parading around the crucified Haman, the focus of their greatest hatred. So that's one reason why the Christians might not want to keep raising Esther in mixed communities like that.
That is fascinating. I did not know that. We were, my wife and I, a few years ago, went down among the Huichol Indians in Mexico who were missionized by the Roman Catholics. And it reminds me a little bit of some of the things you're talking about in the interpretation of this story. They have a passion play in which the hero is Judas.
Yeah.
Wow.
So it just goes to show you can culturally, you can come up with some rather unusual interpretations of these things. Anyway, thank you so much. I'm sorry I took so much time.
No, I should have been
really
quicker in my answer. Sorry.
Oh, that's okay. That's okay. Thank you, Lauren, for your contribution. Dr. Lightburn, I think you are Dell. And I'm going to ask you to unmute and make your comment. You're still muted.
I think I have all kinds of.
There you go.
Oh, yeah.
All right.
I have problems.
So now we can hear you.
Professor Turner, I have not a question, but something you might want to go further with. I don't know how far you'll get with it, but let me give you the experience that makes me want to raise this issue. I had in graduate school a rabbi with whom I became real good friends, from whom I took 2 courses. And in that class, I learned much about what takes place within Judaism. It is in that class that I discovered that the book of Esther is in fact a novel, what we will call a novel in our language in English. When I came to teach here in Tallahassee, I taught a class for which I was not trained, but they had no teachers in religion to teach it. And that class is called Introduction to Religion, in which I have to do all the religions possible in the world to teach this class. I taught that class for something like 8 or 9 years. And 1 year, I think is my second year teaching that class, I became friends with a rabbi, one of the local rabbis. And I developed this system whereby I would ask anybody I knew in the community here who was a leader in a particular religious tradition to take a night or 2 nights to do this class in the area in which they were more competent than I am. So this rabbi would always come to my class and do the issue of Judaism. He swore that he will have me do something at his church or his synagogue. And I would always duck him. And once he said, you have to come to Purim. So I couldn't get away. So I had to go to Purim. And he said, you have to speak. He emphasized, you have to speak. You are the speaker for this night. It was a Friday evening, in fact. He knew I was a Seventh-day Adventist. So he said, you have good time. You could prepare for it. And so I prepared for what I had to say for Purim. And I said in my opening statement, I am very pleased that I can speak to you without fear tonight, because you and I learned from you, I'm talking to the congregation, that I'm talking about a novel. And they clapped and clapped and clapped till I almost couldn't begin to speak. Here is my question to you. Do you know of any group within Christianity that understands that this text is a novel?
Right. Well, the idea that the book is a novel rather than, you might call it an historical document, that is something which is fairly common. In fact, you know, those who hold or insist on its historicity, those who insist on that, are generally, you know, on the almost exclusively on the conservative end of things.
Right.
So the general idea. So the idea that it is a novel, or sometimes the term that's used is a novella. Okay, so a novella is novel-like, but it has certain characteristics. And some of the characteristics in the book of Esther are particularly like the characteristics of a novella. So many people would say the book has been misunderstood because, as you were saying, it's a novel or novella, and part of its the characteristics of that genre is a sense of humor. So when you read the book of Esther, there's exaggeration from beginning to end. You know, the king has to bring in all his advisors, all the bloated bureaucracy of the Persian Empire to come up with a law which says that men should rule their own wives at home. Now, in the culture of the time, that would be considered something so obvious, you know, like it's like asking us to pass a law telling people don't forget to breathe, you know. So the king is a buffoon. And so when we come to the violence, we should also see that as exaggerated for effect. So it's humorous effect. These are not real deaths. These are novel deaths. There has been an attempt to say that in particular, not just a novel or a novella, but carnivalesque.
Yes.
So a carnivalesque novel. So you take the characteristics of the carnival, which have excess, you know, a normal reserve is thrown to one side and everything is exaggerated. That's what we see when you read the book closely. You know, Haman is not just going to get back against Mordecai, it's every Jew from throughout the empire. You know, I mean, this is megalomania on a scale that goes beyond even Hitler, probably. You know, so it says, look, take a deep breath and read it with imagination, not just with literalistic zeal to know on what year this actually happened. So not so much groups as in denominations or whatever, but within scholarly circles, yes, understanding it as a novel would be fairly commonly supported.
Thank you very much. A very fine presentation. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lightburn, for that contribution. I have also heard that in a Bible class a few years ago, when I did ask the question, you know, when I said, what did we think Esther was doing when she went into the king and then came back out the next morning? Yeah. Simply because I kept saying, when I was in Sabbath school in primary, you know, kindergarten, Esther was presented as this virtuous woman who God chose to save his people. And then you get older and you read the book and you go, okay, says who? You know, and then you're presented with the idea that you're supposed to read it from the perspective of a novel. I've heard that before. So yeah, thank you so much.
And on a more general level, of course, you know, Hebrew narrative is not written simply to communicate facts, but to raise questions, to get us to raise questions and help us to participate. So we work out what's going on without having to be told.
Exactly. Thank you so much. So Ray, Bobby, I'm not sure who's contributing today, but do open your mic and make your contribution. Let's try this again. Okay, unmute.
There we go.
There we go.
Well, I have to go back to the beginning, because what intrigued me was you said there are 3 versions of the story. So I was curious as what is the sources for the story? What is the oldest manuscripts? And then if there's these 3 stories, why did they choose the one without God in it? And then everybody goes around injecting God into it. So where did these stories come from? And it seems a rather convoluted way of getting.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Yeah, thank you, Ray. Well, yeah, sometimes the simplest questions are the most complex to answer. So in this case, you know, there have been quite a few arguments, but if you wanted to know what the consensus is, the consensus is that the Hebrew version, that's the one that, you know, we have in our Bibles, that Hebrew version is the original version, more or less. And the reason why it isn't because there's hard evidence of that, because the oldest Esther manuscript that we have is early medieval. So I'm sure you've heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls. You know, I mean, those are the oldest scrolls we have, but there isn't a copy of Esther among the Dead Sea Scrolls. So maybe they will find it. But that's a book that's missing from Qumran, from the Qumran scrolls. Why? Well, there are all kinds of reasons that have been suggested, but that's speculation. But the reason why it's said that the original version is the Hebrew version without God is that most people think it's easier to think that a book without God is translated into Greek, and the Greek translators feel the need to insert God into it in order to make it kosher, as it were, right? It's easier to believe that than that somebody gets a version of the book with God in it and systematically excludes him from it. Now, I mean, you could argue that, but most people find that to be less likely. So the ultimate answer is, when it comes to the early history of the transmission of these books, we simply don't know. My own take on it is what I've just said. I think the original version is the Hebrew without God, and that the Greek translators inserted him, possibly because this book without God was creating some problems for people who wondered where he was. So they said, we'll put him in. I think that's how it worked.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Thank you for your contribution, Ray. I have Art. You are up next. Join our conversation.
Thank you. Dr. Turner, I want to thank you for another stimulating presentation. And I've said this several times, and probably people are getting tired of hearing me say it, but I heard a Jewish rabbi on YouTube one time talk about how Jews use the Bible to start the conversation, and Christians use it to end it. And and thankfully, you use it in the way the Jews use it, and that is to start the conversation. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you for doing that. And of course, Adventists are famous for using Ellen White in the same way to end the conversation. I can't tell you how many times I've come up with an idea in a Sabbath school or church and somebody squelches it immediately because Ellen White said. But at any rate, I was kind of struck at the euphemisms that are used in the book, how the king of Ahasuerus brings Vashti into after this drunken party where he's pretty soused and he just wants people to see her great beauty. I suspect it was more than looking at her face. And another something that else had struck me, I was thinking about the other day, that's a different story, that about when the spies were sent to scout out Canaan. I've often kind of wondered how it was that these guys got to know Rahab. And I just looked at the story and it says, here's the story. It leaves out a lot of the narrative. It says, then Joshua, the son of Nun, sent 2 men as spies secretly from Shittim, saying, go view the land, especially Jericho. So they went and entered the house of a prostitute whose name was Rahab and rested there. I thought that's another bit of an euphemism. Guys are out of town on business, and the first thing they do is happen to just enter the house of a prostitute and rest there. Well, anyway, that's off topic.
But you see, if I can just say this, you see, this is typical Hebrew narrative style. We're told what they did, and it's left up to us to make the connections. This happens all the time in the Hebrew Bible, and we make a mistake when we say, well, because it doesn't say it, it means it couldn't have happened. Well, it might have happened or it might not have happened, but how do you take it? It's a conversation between the reader and the text. Sorry for interrupting. But
no, I thank you for that. Some years ago, I ran across Friedman's book about the disappearance of God and read it, and it stunned me because it's amazing how something reasonably obvious should be obvious because we've read things with a certain understanding all along that we didn't even notice it. And you pointed it out to us, and it's clear as day when you read looking for it. And I wonder if it's a bit of a clue. You mentioned how the Shekinah glory was last seen at the dedication of Solomon's temple. The last public miracle in the Old Testament is Elijah and the on Mount Carmel with the altar, lighting the altar on fire. And I wonder if it may be a bit of a clue as to when the books were written about it. You know, those were probably far enough in the past that nobody could stand up and say, hold it, I was there. That's not quite how it happened. And it struck me as well that in Acts chapter 5, the apostles, it says everyone is being healed who was brought to them. And people were even bringing people who were ill and confined to stretchers, that sort of thing, near Peter so that his shadow might pass over them. And I'm not sure where I'm going with this. It just seems the farther we are from a story, the more superstitions are laced into the story, interweaved into the story. And it does make me wonder how soon after the events of Esther, if it was an actual true story, was the book actually written? Because it doesn't seem to have any of those tells that we often see when something is written some time back or long after the events. The miracles that would normally be seen in a book like that.
Okay, well, you raise, I'll try to be short with this, is that when we think of, when was the book written? We belong in a culture which is text dominant. So unless it's written down or, written down in some way, then the document doesn't exist. But the Bible arose in a culture that was hearing dominant. So before it was written down, it would have been told by word of mouth, and that could happen immediately after. So it could similarly, in the New Testament, some people say, well, look at the Gospels, they weren't written for a few decades after, not written down for a few decades, therefore shows it's all fairy tales. No, this is to misunderstand how hearing dominant societies work. Rabbis taught, their disciples heard, they repeated what the teacher had said. And at a certain time, if that rabbi's reputation persisted, you needed to write it down. But you weren't writing down something you're making up. You're writing down what the tradition has preserved up to that point. And there might be something else included in that as well, of course. So when it comes to saying, if Esther refers to events that happened, when was the book written? Well, the book can be in existence. This sounds a bit mad, but the book can be in existence before it's written, because it's being transmitted orally in a society which is hearing dominant. It's the way things are done. Not in our culture, but in that culture it was. And in some cultures, even to this day, they're still hearing dominant. So I wouldn't worry so much about when was the first hard copy. Before the hard copy, there could well be decades or more of oral transmission.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for your contribution, Art. Pastor Maruka, I hope I did not butcher the pronunciation of your name just now. I am going to ask you to unmute your mic and join our conversation.
Yes, hello, hi. Was it me? You meant Marjukka?
Yes, Maruka.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Turner, for your presentation. I have a question that has to do maybe with something that you were kind of hinting towards in your previous answer. How much of the Book of Esther would you regard as some kind of satire or kind of critical comedy? I've been doing some translation on the first chapter, and I have the feeling that it is quite satirical, especially towards, or quite critical towards the king. And how about the genre of the rest of the book? Could that give any kind of indication on how to read the book and why God would be absent in it if it should be read as some kind of satire? And of course, then, if yes, who would be then the target of the satire? Probably not only the Persian king, or who would it be directed towards?
Yeah, well, Mariuka, yeah. Good to see you again. I'm glad that you still ask the same kind of difficult questions you did when you were my student at Newbold. Well, you know, when you start reading the book of Esther, the king comes across as being a complete idiot, really. I mean, a real buffoon. I didn't share this as one of the arguments that I was dealing with, but there have been people who've said the word king occurs more times in the book of Esther than in any other biblical book. Do you know why? Because we are supposed to see in the king, King Ahasuerus, a type of the God of Israel. And I say, anybody who can argue that has no sense of humor. I mean, it is impossible to say that the buffoon, King Ahasuerus, who has to bring in all of his bloated civil service to come up with a law to say that husbands should rule their wives, you know, is that an image of God? No, it isn't. So I think, yeah, there are elements of the book that are satirical and parts of it that are comic. There are some parts of it which it might be difficult to take in that way. Are they more tragic? I mean, to our minds, the fate of the Jews, of potential fate of the Jews, cannot be funny, cannot be satirical or comic. But then, you know, Jewish humor works in strange ways. I mean, there have been Jewish, I forget the name of the movie now, it was by Mel Brooks, was it? I've only seen a sketch, but anyway, it's an attempt at what you might call dark humor, and it's about the Holocaust. Now you think, goodness me, if I started to try to make comic comments about the Holocaust, I'd be run out of town. But within the Jewish, some within the Jewish community use the humor as a safety valve to let, you know, let the steam go. Now, I think parts of it are satire. I've committed to write an article where I look at the genre of the book of Esther and whether that gives any clue as to why God is missing from it. Is it the genre of the book? We have other biblical books that are satires or satirical. The book of Jonah is satirical. But if satire explains the absence of God in Esther, why is he present in Jonah? The idea of satire by itself doesn't eliminate the possibility of God. If I think most people would accept that Jonah is a satire. So how much that, so I think we may have two separate questions or two separate issues. Yeah, I think the book is a satire. I think you're right. There are comic episodes. I'm not sure whether everything is comic, but there's a clear comic thread going through the book. Does that explain why God isn't present? As if, you know, God doesn't have a sense of humor. No, I'm not so sure about that. I think it might be two separate entities. But it's a good question. It's a good question.
Thank you so much, and looking forward to reading that article regarding the genre.
Okay, right. Okay, thank you, Mayuka.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pastor Mayuka. Doug, it is now your turn to join our conversation.
Thank you. This certainly was thought-provoking as well as excellent, and it provoked lots of thoughts. And I am usually not a note taker in these presentations, but I was furiously writing notes to myself. And it's been said that sometimes fools rush in where angels fear to tread, and I am mindful of that with what I'm about to say, but I found myself trying to be very practical, and that may defy the very purpose that a Jewish narrative might have been created. But I'm going to risk that and interested in your feedback. You said to focus on the end is one possibility, to focus on the end of the book. And what I took from that is to do what is at hand. The profound comment that Mordecai made, you may be here for this moment. And that made me think of something in historic Adventism that I think as Adventists don't often talk about, is the strong position that Adventists took in the abolition of slavery. And so then the question is, what might that mean in the modern context? And I think it's fair in my mind to say God doesn't always need super virtuous, super religious people to do what needs to be done in the moment. Having said that, what also came to mind was Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And I haven't read all of his writings, that's for sure, but I realize in what little I've read, the struggle that he went through living in the US at the time of the Holocaust, and how he made a choice to go back to Germany, knowing that that was a very, very high-risk decision, which ultimately cost him his life. And so as I listen to your presentation, and as the familiarity that I have with Esther, it begs the question for me individually and then collectively as Adventists, if God can use the jackass of Balaam, and he said he could use the stones in the pavement of Jerusalem, he can use most anybody, I think. In fact, it doesn't even need to be a human. And so I'm wrestling with this idea of, in my life, maybe there will be times when I'm called in some small way to do my part. And I think about right now, the genocide in Uganda that our church is largely silent on. And I think of these other cases of where it seems like Adventists are not engaged like they were 100 years ago with the issue of slavery, even though the Bible is so clear pro-slavery, the morality is also very clear. And maybe I'm way, way, way afield with the book of Esther and your presentation, but those are questions that I'm now wrestling with in more real ways because of what you have said and brought to my mind and how I am trying to be honest with myself. Anyway, for what it's worth.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Doug. Let me just respond briefly. Is one of the features of the book, obviously, is that if God is taken out of the equation in the telling of the story, then the emphasis is then placed on the human characters, because they're the only characters we've got. We don't have a divine character explicitly mentioned in the book. And so on the positive side, a possible reflection, one which some people do make, is that the book of Esther points out the necessity of human involvement in seeking to do good or justice in the world. And there's a principle that runs through many biblical books, which is sometimes referred to as dual causality. By dual causality, what is meant is this: God desires for certain things to happen, but in order for them to happen, there has to be a partnership with human beings. So what happens due to a partnership, dual causality. Did God do it? Well, in one sense, yeah. Did human beings do it? Well, yeah. Without human cooperation, nothing would have happened. So if you're wanting to take a positive, I wouldn't say a positive spin, but looking for positive things from the nature of the book of Esther, it emphasizes that what we do matters. And that if we just agree that something is just in principle, but don't do it, then we're not fully human. In the Old Testament, justice isn't a noun, it's a verb. You do justice. Justice as a noun is something we discuss in Sabbath school class before we go home. But biblically, justice is a verb that we do. So I think some of your reflections are quite helpful. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Doug, for that contribution. Lauren, I don't know if you want us to pause here and just have our closing prayer.
Sure.
Just in case there are people who have to leave.
I always try to let people know what's coming up next. And next week, we have Lindsay Painter, absent Painter, coming back. And she's been taking some classes in trauma and how to cope with trauma. And she, as you know, Lindsay works for a social work agency. So these sort of psychosocial things are very much on her mind. She does training constantly on these topics. So she's going to be taking on the topic of how trauma affects people. So it's going to be a little bit more of a psychological orientation, maybe a little less of a biblical one, but still having to do with our spiritual lives, clearly, right? That's what it's about. So I always want to make sure people realize that. By the way, we have an interesting rest of the month coming up, or a rest of the year coming up. In August, we have Matthew Cortman coming. We have Rolf Pohler from Germany coming to teach for us. And we have David Neff, who was my pastor when I was at Walla Walla College and then became a editor of Christianity Today, and he's coming. But David has taken a strange turn in his latter years. He is now completely devoted his life to ministry of music. David was one of those guys who could do almost anything he wanted to do. And the thing that, when it came right down to it, is the end of his life was wanting to do music. So he's going to be talking to us about hymns. We haven't really done much on music. We had Nick Zork come a couple of years ago, and he did a really good job on worship and music. But David's going to be talking about the potential for learning from hymns. It's a kind of a passion of his. So we've got some fun stuff coming up, and I'm looking forward to keeping you guys on board. And let me just take a little moment here. There's still some people with hands up, so we will get to them. But let me take just a moment here to have a prayer for you. Kind Heavenly Father, thank you for the teaching ministry of Dr. Turner and what we've learned today. This has been fascinating, and thank you so much for blessing so many of our teachers with such great wisdom. I pray that you will bless each person in this class today. I don't know what each person brings as they come here today. We're not in the same room. We can't really spend a lot of time visiting, but I know that everybody needs the presence of God and the power of God in their lives right now. And I pray that you will touch them in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, carry on, Tamika.
Okay, great. Ed, it is your turn to join our conversation. Please unmute your mic.
Thank you.
Great.
Appreciated your stimulating analysis, Dr. Turner. Thank you. You said a few moments ago in response to a question that maybe God was taken out of the story. Maybe he was not taken out. Maybe he was not in it at all to be taken out. Today, 2,000 to 3,000 years later, after these things were written, we look at the Bible and tend to view it as a cogent, altogether thing that has a particular purpose. We open it, we expect to find God, we expect to find religious information, we expect to find spirituality. And now in the book of Esther, we're puzzled because we don't find that. So we, I guess, assume it's all been taken out. Maybe that's because we tend to view the Jews as just about their religion. But the Jews were way more than their religion. They were a country, they were a civilization. They conducted trade and business and commerce with other people. They had international relationships they tended to. They engaged in warfare. There was a lot more to the Jews than their religion, but perhaps above all, they were an ethnic group. And to this day, they are primarily an ethnic group. Some of them are Orthodox Jews and very strict, and others are liberal and don't observe religion at all, but they're all Jews. And the people group, the ethnic identity, which we can see today, well, you're judged if you're a Jew by your mother's lineage. The people group idea is very powerful with Jews, at least as powerful as their religion. So it's entirely possible that what we have in the book of Esther is a bit of secular history that is very important to a people group. They can date back some liberation from all of that in their Feast of Purim. Thus, it's their book. It's their history book. It's a bit of their background. And as you well pointed out, Dr. Turner, these people are out there in the diaspora. They may or may not have been very religiously observant. We really just don't know. But they were certainly Jews wherever they were, and it was important to them to protect their status. So I'm wondering if this is just a bit of secular history of a group of people.
Okay, well, thank you, Ed, for your stimulating comment, as always. We have a problem, though. I mean, I have dallied with what you've been talking about as well, and thought that I was on the road to somewhere, and because I don't usually think of myself as being a profound thinker, I thought, well, maybe, I've tripped over something here. But the more study I've done, what's left me with is this: the concept of secular history and things like secular nationalism probably never existed before the 18th century. And we separate out religion from other things. We have we have religion, the football team I support, the supermarket I go to. These are separate entities of life. But in the ancient world, religion is what gave coherence to your people group. So if Esther is an example of secular history, let's, for argument's sake, say that what you were saying is absolutely true. The book of Esther is simply a secular history. If it is, then it is utterly unique in the ancient world. Which doesn't mean to say you're wrong. but it means the onus is on you to prove it.
I hear you. And I guess I'd start with the prima facie evidence that God's not in the story.
Yes. There's another book where God isn't present, but it's not a biblical book. First Maccabees. First Maccabees, I was rushing through it prior to giving this presentation. But I think I'm right in saying that in First Maccabees, God is never mentioned. But there are many references to priests. Now, what do priests do? Many references to worship, many references to prayer. It's just that God never quite gets mentioned. It's just that everything associated with him is mentioned. So Esther takes it to another extreme, of course, in that it's not just that God isn't mentioned, but none of the other stuff that you get in First Maccabees is mentioned. I mean, I'll be quite upfront with you. I started out in an attempt to write a book which mapped all of the ways in which people have found God in Esther or explained his absence. And then come to a decision, you know, as to which of the strongest arguments. And unfortunately, I had to give up. It was simply impossible. I just couldn't keep all the balls in the air at once. So if you ask me what I think the answer is to all of this, you know, it's all right for me to say, you know, Brother Ralph Snyder, you know, I think you might not have, you know, your suggestion might not be your finest hour. You know, that's what I might say that to you. But if you're to ask me, so what is the solution? What I honestly, at the moment, I'm really not sure, except I believe that the absence of God has to be taken seriously and not explained away as simply a little hurdle that's been put there to entertain us while we see God hidden here, there, and everywhere. I think we've got to take that God is absent. Why and what are the implications of it? That's something else. But to say, well, you can find him quite easily. Well, if you can find him quite easily, what's the point of hiding him in the first place? What is the literary game that's going on? You know, so I think I know on which side of the fence I am, but I'm still not absolutely certain how to understand the book. I have a hunch that rather than saying I am looking for things that aren't there, my hunch is that the book is more profound than I think it is.
Well, you'll be pleased to know that when you said this might not be my finest hour, that my wife chuckled. She resonated with that.
Well, of course, many people might think that this presentation I gave is not my finest hour either.
Thank you, Ed, for your contribution and for that insert of humor. We appreciate that so much. Vince Melashenko, I hope I got that correct. I've been butchering names all afternoon. It is your turn to join our conversation. Go ahead and unmute your mic.
Yes. Dr. Turner, I always appreciate your presentations, and today's no exception. And this is a quick question, nothing tricky like any of the previous ones. I just wonder, by any chance, in a secular history, has a Esther appeared in any manuscript, scroll, stone from that time that lists the king and his queens or anything? Is there anything that corroborates that she existed secularly?
No, is the short answer. So there isn't any evidence of that. There have been a few Mordecais found, but that may simply because it's well, not a common name, but it's a known name from that time. Some people have argued that in order to be a queen, the queen would have to have come from a particular family or families in the Persian aristocracy. Therefore, it's highly unlikely that a Jew would have done that. But of course, that's only what a tradition is. I mean, it doesn't mean to say because that's the usual way, then it couldn't have happened. So I think that, I mean, we call her Queen Esther and so on, but as somebody's mentioned, you know, this king would have had numerous women. And the fact that she isn't mentioned or can't, it might have an effect on how we treat the book. It doesn't mean to say that we treat it any less seriously, but is it serious in the sense of being an historical chronicle? Or is it serious in the same way that the parable of the prodigal son is serious stuff without us having to insist that Jesus is recounting events that happened and he read in the newspaper the week before? But as far as historical evidence for the characters as they're presented in the book, currently we don't have any external evidence for that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vince, for your contribution. Mike, it is your turn to join our conversation.
Yes, hello, Professor.
Hello.
Nice to see you.
Yeah, you got your wife to speak first, I see.
Yes, of course, always let the wife speak first. No, I have actually completely other questions. Well, although one is kind of related to what Mariuka was saying. So two questions. The first one, I'm finding it quite often, how should I put this? You know, the blessing of the Reformation, but also the kind of the curse of the Reformation that, you know, through the Reformation and especially through Luther, translating the Bible so that it's in the hands of the common people and everybody can read it. And then with it, you know, kind of the understanding, well, everybody can read it. It's so clear, it's there, it's simple, you know, you don't need clergy, which obviously comes from a historical issues that they had at that time. But, you know, again, I think this presentation showed that it is more than just reading the text, because you do have to understand, and this is what I find all the time with the Old Testament. You do have to understand the culture. You need to understand the language as much as possible as we can, 2000 and maybe even more plus years later. So, but still we find this, especially in our churches, we find this very simplistic approach to the Bible. It's there, it's written like this, you know. I mean, even the name Esther itself, you showed that there's a bit more complexity behind that. Maybe that wasn't actually even her real name, but only the name for the story to convey the notion of, hey, God is absent. Or God is, what did you say was the exact words?
Hidden, I will hide, yeah.
Yes, I will hide. So, but then, you know, we are going to it with our post-Reformation mind, and like, oh, but, you know, it's here, Esther must have existed as the person Esther. And I'm wondering, how can we, how can we help our church members? Because, you know, when you come to Sabbath school class and then this discussion, and as I said before, but, you know, then Ellen White has said this, and then the discussion is over. How can we actually help to teach our church members to see that, hey, you know, yes, of course, there is this level of simplistic, you can read the story and get it, but the idea, as you just showed again, and in all the years you have taught me over and over again, that there's so much more complexity behind it. It tries to drag you as the reader into the story and wrestle with it, but we somehow don't do that. And we can explain it easy, make a sermon, and then, oh, this is the explanation, you know. Yeah, this is the question number one. Question number two, the more I dealt with the book of Esther, I find it, and especially also with my wife having translated the first parts and then always talking with me, I kind of find it kind of like a first feminism book, or strengthening the position of the woman. And what I find though curious is why Vashti is always being made so kind of evil and this, the bad one, because she just didn't want to participate in that, well, basically, which was an orgy. She had to go there naked in front of all these drunken men. Who knows what would have happened. So she is the evil one, or kind of, also in the Christian sense, Vashti, who cares? But Esther, she is the heroine, even though she might have had dubious sexual with the king situations. So, yeah, and she both actually stood up for what they found reasonable and important. Vashti stood up that said, hey, I'm not participating in this sexual orgy or whatever is going to happen here. And Esther said, well, I'm standing up for my people. So both risked their life, because the same situation that Esther did later on was, theoretically punishable by not being the queen anymore and being kicked out. Yeah, so those two questions.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, you traversed a few mountaintops and valleys on that. How to read the Bible.
Yeah.
I think the problem is when we read the Bible, generally speaking, without wanting to simplify a complex issue, say within the church, is that we're not so much reading the Bible, but we're finding the evidence to prove that we're right. So we believe this, and because we believe this, there's a text here which proves it. And you know what? Last week I found another text that proves that we're right. So now you've got two reasons for believing it. But rather than reading the text inductively, people say, well, because it's the inspired word of God, it must have these characteristics. Rather than saying, let's read it and see how the inspiration actually works. It might be rather different than our presuppositions. So, as you know, without referring to the source of this, we are encouraged to engage in a plain reading of the Bible. The problem with that is that in order, I think I may have said this on Adventist Today before, in order to have a plain reading, you first of all need to have a plain text and a plain reader. And if you don't have a plain reader or a plain text, you can't have a plain reading. And the problem is the Bible is more, if I just confine myself now to narrative, because that's what we've been looking at with Esther. Biblical narrative, just simply from a literary point of view, forget whether you agree with what the narrative is saying, but from a literary point of view, many parts of biblical narrative are profound. They are deep because of the way in which they're written and the literary conventions they use. So what we should be doing, for example, in places like Sabbath school, is not asking a question and providing the answer on the same page. Asking an open question and referring people to prophets and kings or patriarchs and prophets, where Ellen White will give the answer for us. But to give people basic skills in reading the Bible inductively. That way, you discover things you never knew before. Whereas the other way, you're only discovering proof for what you knew before you started reading. I'll give you a tantalizing fun fact, shall I? Just to illustrate this. Been talking about the two kinds, the canonical version of Esther and the apocryphal version of Esther. If you read Ellen White's exposition of Esther, Now tell it not in Gath, and publish it not in Ashkelon. But her exposition of Esther is closer to the apocryphal version than it is to the canonical version. And in another act of flagrant self-promotion, I say I've just published an article on this as well. I do things that, you know, anyway, but my point in making that is what we need to do is to read the biblical text, then read Ellen White and ask the question, how did she end up saying that? Is she reading the text inductively, or is she simply asserting something? And there's a big difference, as you know, from when you submitted assignments at college level. There's a big difference between arguing your case and simply asserting your presuppositions. And secondly, very briefly, there's been some interesting work done on the Book of Esther as a kind of a proto-feminist kind of document. And it again means we adjust our focus. If we emphasize Vashti, maybe even more so than Esther, is extolled by many feminist interpreters as being the real deal. So there's more in the book to challenge us along those lines too.